Welcome to my presentation for Transnational Organized Crime, Global Security, and Homeland Security Brief. This PowerPoint concerns the roots of U.S. infrastructure in response to transnational terrorism and criminal entities domestically. The synchronization of these units has served as the footing for political and historical events in the United States and international partners. To understand the hierarchical structure of these organizations and their motivations involves multi-level assessment of these organizations and their political, social, and internal associations. The efforts of United States intelligence are not new. They have been proliferated by American governmental authorities since the development of America. Today, these efforts are streamlined into legislative and enforcement strategic response to ensure the protection of people and the critical infrastructure in America and abroad. The United States has developed an imperativeness as it is associated with intelligence and transnational criminal organization. The patterns of data that help to inform on these business and intellectual processes helps to establish models to support strategic response and planning that is integral to national and international security. The attraction of these evidence-based models is seen in the successes of varying levels of informal and formal intelligence efforts since the nascent period in America. The utilization of a myriad of counterterrorism strategies have been formulated in response to the events of 9/11 and subsequent terror attacks on the United States homeland. However, these efforts are not new. They are based on a historical model of intelligence and actionable strategic planning that was implemented before the Civil War. The U.S. government has engaged in intelligence activities from its development, utilizing covert activities to spy on European actors to disband their political and social control. The American efforts grew to include evidence-based methodologies that evolved over three periods of American history: the nascent period, the transitional period, and the period of professional intelligence. These periods will be explained in subsequent slides. However, understanding how the United States developed actionable intelligence is important to understanding the synergy of transnational organizations and their effect on the United States war on terror. The intertwining revelations associated with how these operations function have been integral to the development of legislation, national security organizations, and critical infrastructure response and security. Intelligence has been defined as information that informs on processes, organizations, or people. The cultural and social impacts of radicalization have been a key predictive characteristic for the formalization of actionable intelligence, forming the baseline for the fight against organized crime and the terror it funds. To understand where the United States is, it must be understood where it began. Intelligence began as a tool for presidents to develop and conduct foreign policy. The use of intelligence was highly political, utilized to bring together organizations like the Sons of Liberty, who organized to gather intelligence against the British in 1775. From there, organizations were utilized to gather intelligence on various groups, incorporating this intelligence-based agency in the legislative and political space. The history of organized crime is not new to the American way of life. In North America, the issue of organized crime has been associated with illegal activities and European covert operations to figure out these activities and their effect on government policies. In fact, European settlers were involved in organized crime activity within North American settlements, helping to formulate the first instances of law enforcement and covert intelligence to uncover these activities. The criminal groups that existed in these settlements and in the first cities of America were involved in thefts, gangs, bribery, gambling, and extortion. However, actionable intelligence did not truly identify linkages within terrorism until much later in the history of America. The committees developed to help serve foreign interests were housed under the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. George Washington developed his own personal intelligence gathering authority in the Culper Ring, a group that was involved in covert surveillance to gather actionable information for the political needs of the United States. Under Washington, the development of ad hoc intelligence operations was utilized to inform on expeditions and colonization efforts, also known as Manifest Destiny. These efforts informed on the European activities, but also on other cultures and activities in colonization expeditions. These efforts directly funded expeditions to secure land and gold from these foreign lands. The advantage of these exploits served to help with military endeavors as well, like the Mexican-American War. Transnational organized crime, or TOCs, serve to proliferate the business processes of many illicit criminal organizations. These business processes are sometimes in legal origin, but organized crime is described by the group that engages in the crimes and the activities they operate in. These offenses help to define the business and hierarchical structure of these groups, helping to formulate an understanding of how these groups engage with the national and domestic scene. The United States has TOCs that are comprised of networks, identified under criminal groups, standard rigid hierarchy, regional hierarchy, clustered hierarchy, and the core group. These operations help to categorize the elements of organized crime for the purpose of linking characteristics and understanding behaviors and attributes of criminal organizations. The United States has examples of all these groups. The criminal groups have low public profiles. They operate for a specific purpose within their criminal projects. Understanding the categories of gangs and how they exist is also associated with understanding the relationship between victimization, corruption, political violence, and radicalization that confers with terrorism and national security. The international studies that inform on these processes are inextricably linked with organized crime. Some of these groups, as we see in America, operate under one of these many categories. Clustered hierarchy and criminal group that has a cluster of operations with a governing management dependent on the group can be found in the 28 Prison Gang, which is a prison gang. When we look at a regional hierarchy, single leader with a centralized leadership structure, example of that could be the Bloods and Crips, which are mostly regional to the projects in California, but they also exist here in Georgia. Criminal groups that operate in criminal networks, they have low public profiles that operate on criminal projects with specific purposes, could be a Dutch gang that involves itself with human trafficking. Standard rigid hierarchy operates with one leader that enforces a hierarchical structure with disciplinary model to establish their influence on violence and business activities. A group like that could be the mafia or one of the Chinese mafia or mob groups. Evidence-based modeling for criminal mitigation has served as the forefront of strategic response, also identified as intelligence-led policing. These models serve as the decision-making policy for the implementation of structural and enforcement efforts against organized crime and transnational affiliations. Situational crime prevention and terrorism is based on a myriad of issues associated with threats in the United States homeland as well as critical infrastructure. The situational crime prevention strategies were also implemented with environmental criminology to assess the effects of terrorism on critical infrastructure and public health. Ultimately, the counterterrorism support structures that were implemented because of 9/11 were based on targeting of terrorists and the prevention of radicalizing conditions that contribute to homegrown and international terror cells. The process is based on evidence-based research and intervention strategy. Parallel research establishes a survey the knowledge that refugee traffic in a country can serve as a risk factor for terrorism. There is a defined link between radicalization, victimhood, and political violence. Understanding this relationship is critical to predicting radicalization in regions where terrorism is likely to derive from. This is additionally valuable in assessing risk factors in the development of domestic and international terror cells. The USA Patriot Act provided access to financial and data-driven intelligence to inform on these groups and ideologies. Understanding this critical piece has been integral to the support of Americans' homeland. Additionally, the understanding of these pillars and the risk factors that have contributed to restrictive immigration policies in the United States, Europe, and other Western countries has definitely proliferated our immigration and migrant response. The United States particularly involved immigration in the expansion of the USA Patriot Act, specifically targeting illegal immigrants. The interventions were formulated in response to the pillars of terrorism and the evidence of successful interventions in the field of counterterrorism. Situational crime prevention has been identified in literature as the variable assessment of terrorist groups, methods, publication, and intelligence that help to secure critical infrastructure and lives. In applying the theoretical model to organized crime in America, we must understand the development of the structural hierarchy of these groups, their evolution into convergence with terror organizations. The alien conspiracy theory argues that the development of the organized crime in America was a direct result of the Sicilian immigrant groups that formed criminal families and associations. The immigrant colonies culminated in other groups, but the proliferation of violent ideals came from the Italian ideology, according to the theory. The development of the Black Hand extortion was based on a contrary argument, one that suggested that these groups were motivated by inequalities and social ills. Ultimately, the Black Hand extortion grew from a myriad of groups, some not associated with Sicilian crime families. The extortion technique, seen in New York City and Chicago, was taken advantage of by organizations across a larger criminal network, some not associated with Sicilian families. This Black Hand ultimately served as a reminder to the public to fear and revere these criminal groups. This example is only one of a myriad of examples of ideas shared between criminal organizations and the proliferation of activities that support transnational organized crime and terrorism. Shared motivations and practices serve as the blurred barrier between the two, serving as a threat for national intelligence and organized law enforcement response. The United States and global empirical sources attribute the phenomena of criminal enterprise and terrorism as an ailment of social, cultural inequality and the alien conspiracy theory. The alien conspiracy theory posits the idea that migrants utilize their outside influence to engage in organized crime in America. The alien conspiracy theory delegates the issue of violence and social disruption to migrant groups. However, the structure of these groups is largely contested by other theorists like Lombardo, who argues the fact that the Black Hand crime group utilized extortion and was not motivated by anything other than the strain of American social and racial conflict. The motivation had nothing to do with social ills of immigration, rather the pressures of American society that positively positioned the maltreatment of minority and immigrant citizens. A good example of the alien conspiracy theory is seen in the proliferation of Sicilian mafias and Italian crime families because of banding networks of Italian immigrants that bought over perceived violence and customs that increased the synergy and organizational efficacy of the Italian crime families and the loyalty seen within. In contrast, MS-13 is a Salvadoran street gang that operates in violent crime groups throughout California and the western United States. Their existence is a social construct brought on by Salvadoran immigrants looking for structural and financial support. Due to the lack of governmental support, they developed their own environment with social and political hierarchy and financial incentivization. They are currently one of the most dangerous gangs in America, but their motivation is not due to social ills in El Salvador. Arguably, they are the product of the social and cultural implications of perceived failures of the American government as it pertains to the treatment of migrant groups. Terrorism and transnational crime are based on linkages of illicit and political activities that are associated with acts of terror and illicit activities domestically and abroad. The groups that collaborate under the terrorism and organized crime nexus have a myriad of organizational structures. However, they are designed to support each other, aided by the globalization of markets and their enterprises that are dynamic and multivariate. The criminal enterprises operate covertly, serving as a funding source for terroristic activities. They operate within two categories: illicit enterprise and political influence, and illicit enterprise and insurgency with an asymmetrical structure. This relationship serves as a backdrop for the complexities of these criminal organizations and the activities they engage in that define their identity. The attributes that contribute to the identity of these organizations help to determine their motivations and the impact of the activities. Mid-level and low-level organizations are typically loosely oriented with a leaderless structure. They are arranged to flex to the needs of their environment, and the vagueness associated with these associations help them to move freely between markets. The cooperative patterns involved with the criminal organizations and their terrorist consumers are interlinked by shared motivations among higher level players. Criminal organizations that have strict hierarchy and recognize the vertical organizational structure optimization can support their own efficiency. Illicit enterprise has been linked with insurgency at the political level. The demarcation between the two used to be prominent, but the intersection of the globalized market has contributed to political motivations for extremist and organized criminal entities. The market has driven a collaboration between these groups that proliferates their shared terms and deemed a political convergence that creates difficulties in defining the differences between the two groups. There is the possibility that a terrorist group could function as a criminal organization, and the same is adversely true. The consideration regarding these cooperative associations is based on the customers that these organizations target. The mutual benefit these collaborations have on criminal organizations, insurgency group, and terrorists is part of the issue regarding how these collaborations operate on a global market. The transnational organized crime influences political and governmental associations by additionally affecting corruption. These intersections create turbulence in the global market and contribute to the collaborative scope of the criminal and terrorist organizations. The impact of these associations on the broader market has had devastating. Profit motivation is the greatest reason for criminal enterprise to develop their illicit and legal enterprise. Criminal enterprise has the most integral goal of gaining large profit margins. The gross profit of their business models can be proliferated by a few criminal activities, including violence, extortion, trafficking, gambling, and other acts. Criminal groups such as the American La Cosa Nostra, Mafia in America engaged in enterprises that were internally and politically motivated. The illegal enterprises help to fund narco-insurgencies and terroristic activities. The underlying attributes of these organizations are associated with how they utilize legal activities to support their activities. Criminal enterprises are not built to dismantle the organizations of political players, only to utilize their involvement in politics to fund their interests. The growth of narco-insurgents and narco-terrorism are a prime example of the way that transnational criminal organizations collaborate with terroristic groups to proliferate criminal activity. Narco-insurgents violently attack state security and federal agencies utilizing the hardware of these governmental authorities. Narco-insurgents were seen in Mexico and Colombia, but can sometimes spill over the American border in violent activities perpetrated by the cartels to fund their illicit trade. Illicit enterprise perpetrated by these organizations can engage in asymmetrical insurgency. This is identified by dynamic acts of terroristic violence utilizing unconventional tactics and governmental hardware. Organizations typically responsible for criminal activities can also engage in asymmetrical insurgency because of their homogeneous structure with terroristic organizations. Sometimes the two are one and the same. The United Nations sponsored UN-DOC help to inform on globalized response to organized crime. It determined that organized crime was a dynamic threat to global partners. Globalization of the world economy contributed to growth in the illicit economy as well. Expansion of international and domestic criminal activities served as interlinking association that created new global challenges for the United Nations. These traditional groups expanded beyond localized gangs with loose organizational networks. Instead, these networks collaborated with broader-based, more organized, better funded mafia and cartel structures. The United Nations developed a convention against transnational organized crime, adopted the fight against transnational organized crime, and coordinated response. The international response to terror operations was established to break up cooperation between civil criminal units to disrupt their economic and illicit activity structure. Additional efforts in the United Nations included a protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. The objective was meant to establish human rights considerations for victims of human trafficking. The protocol against smuggling of migrants by land, sea, and air served to deal with a separate issue of smuggling migrants across domestic and international borders. The relationship between radicalization and counterterrorism is inextricably linked, with the policy relevant and political determinations associated with formative legislation and enforcement controls in the battle against terror. The intervention and prevention of terroristic activities are based on the intelligence operations seen in the United States domestic and international policy. The counterterrorism struggles are based on understanding the people that implement these activities. Understanding their cultures, processes, and motivations helps to inform on predictive modeling to analyze and disband them before they attack domestic or international partners. The security of critical infrastructure depends on these efforts. By 2012, the National Institute of Justice developed research through the Domestic Radicalization and Terrorism Program to inform on the process of radicalization and how it contributes to the terrorist belief and lifestyle. The identity processes that also help to define their organizations informed on group dynamics and triggers that enable them to engage in terroristic acts. The implication of this information gathering effort served to secure national borders and international lands. The opportunity to understand the pillars of terrorism and how they relate to conditions suitable for the proper design of security-based initiatives both domestically and abroad serves as an important component to helping us understand the great degree of support for critical infrastructure and terrorism response that is now seen in legislative and enforcement partnerships. Some of the more recent legislation has been grown out of the U.S. Patriot Act and the subsequent legislation. Additionally, the task force initiative pushed by President Obama established partnerships for the gathering and dissemination of actionable intelligence. Partnerships between the U.S. Department of Treasury, Secret Service, FBI would serve the best opportunity to disseminate actionable intelligence to develop and respond to transnational organized crime and terrorism. These efforts are based on dismantling the platforms that help to proliferate and fund criminal activities and critical infrastructure. The growth of counterterrorism strategies depends on the gravity that is placed on intelligence and its utilization in counterterrorism strategy. The Bible basically says that my people suffer from a lack of knowledge, that we should always be searching for wisdom. These criminal organizations are not directed towards the wills of the Bible. The Bible states that no man can serve two masters, one will either love one or hate the other. So when it comes to the gang offers as a government, but it also involves a lot of respect. Individuals can't be concerned with the flesh and carnal desires like money and sex. They should be concerned with the riches of God and His promises. The Bible warns against the pride of the wicked. It leads to their downfall. Evil associations are condemned by God. 1 Corinthians 15:33, King James Version. The financial component of counterterrorism is largely handled by monitoring of financial transaction and money laundering schemes. This is a function of the Secret Service. Partnerships between the Secret Service and the FBI continue in that organizational response to attack networks where it hurts financially. The U.S. Department of Treasury has a key role in the dismantling of financial securities from criminal organizations by safeguarding financial systems from use by terrorists and organized crime entities. It is true that military branches largely rely on intelligence throughout their branches. Utilizing intelligence gathering is an important part of their critical infrastructure. The use of these networks was in direct response to the U.S. Patriot Act that strengthened organizational and political response to terrorism and transnational organized crime by finding the interlinking patterns between these organizations and dismantling the platforms they use to continue criminal activities. The events of 9/11 served as a warning for Americans. It showed the weakness of our critical infrastructure and failure as a country we had as it regards to creating opportunities for detecting and dismantling these organizations domestically and abroad. The Bible speaks about remaining proactive. Vengeance is the Lord. However, God establishes the authority of what that is used to explain and dismantle evil. And these are my references. Thank you for your attentiveness.